tremendously at school and then also at university, and I was totally fed up with history. So when I left university, I never wanted anything to do with history.
Hello and welcome to Harper Broadcast. I'm Amrita Tripathi, in conversation today with John Keay, legendary historian.
No.
I mean, it's actually been quite a challenge to figure out how we're going to structure this conversation. So we'll see how it goes. I was just asking you, your first book has been, that was about 40 years ago.
1973 it was published.
And you're considered one of the pioneers of narrative history.
Yes, I'm a great believer in narrative, and I think that history lends itself to narrative, and that perhaps the academic world have rather hijacked it, and so it's become a kind of exercise in peer review, and too many historians are writing for other historians, basically, and I like to write history for a much wider audience, and the best way to engage a wider audience is to produce an interesting narrative. And also, I think the other essential thing is to write well, and I think anyone writing history, it's important to concentrate as much on the writing as on the history.
And in terms of finding sort of interesting subjects or people to write about, because for example, India Discovered, which has been in print since 1981, you write about how you're almost focusing more on the explorers there, the Indologists, and telling the story through them.
Yes.
I mean, how does that work each time you start researching?
In that particular book, the remit for that book was very vague. I was just in 1981. There was a big Indian exhibition in London at the time. I think Mrs. Gandhi and Pupil Jayaka organised a series of these Festival of India things, and there was one in London. And so publishers were quite keen to have a nice book on India.
You've of course seen the sort of drastic change in the way India itself was viewed from the sort of exotic country that
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? It's quite a sea change.
Yeah, I mean, India's obviously changed enormously. I mean, it's nearly 50 years that I've been coming here, and it's hardly recognisable as the same country as it was then. But in terms of a writer, what the things one notices, first of all, there's an enormous publishing industry here now. There was hardly anything. Just a few foreign publishers had representatives here, but there was no real industry until quite recently. And the number of books being produced in India are now enormous. And I often get asked, why should we have a foreigner writing histories of India? And there was a simple answer to that when I first started writing, is that because Indians weren't doing it themselves. Now quite a lot of there are excellent histories of India being produced by Indian writers. So I'm in a sense a bit redundant, but luckily, I mean, my books have got quite well established, and so they go on being read and consulted and so on. So in the world of publishing, everything's changed. Of course, the other thing is that we've had a technological revolution, and so producing books is now a totally different exercise to what it was from a writer's and a researcher's point of view, as well as from the publishers. And that has made life very much easier for the most part. So in terms of Indian attitudes towards the past, I think there is much more awareness of India's past in India than there used to be. But it's also a sort of more contentious field than it was. Textbooks are constantly being revised as governments change and so on. The academic world is permanently in turmoil, it seems to me, as a result of some new change of government and some new policy towards the past. Well, luckily, as a foreigner, I'm kind of outside of all that debate, and I try not to get involved in it. But you certainly, as a writer of Indian history, you come in for a lot more criticism than you used to. There's always someone who takes exception to something you've written, whether it be about Hindus or Muslims, or whether it be about some current aspect of legal debate or whatever. So you're always liable to fall on the wrong side of a large section of people. Whereas when I first started, there wasn't such a controversial field.
You've you've written also about the East India Company, you were saying,
Yes.
and you were in a panel discussion on this. It's obviously a very contentious period also in
Yes.
terms of. Would you take us through what you think? Because I think Shashi Tharoor called it a sinister beast, and he's been asking for apologies.
Well, Shashi has his own agenda on these things, and he has a big audience to appeal to here in India, and so he does so. I'm more interested in the facts. I mean, for the first 150 years, from 1600 to the 1750s, the company wasn't involved in territorial administration at all. It was a purely commercial organisation. It did found what's now Chennai and Kolkata and Mumbai, but I mean, these were just little what they call factories, trading outposts, if you like, from which where goods were assembled for company ships when they came to collect and take back to the UK, and where goods were landed to. So that it had really no territorial responsibilities at all, and it wasn't interested in government. In fact, the directors of the company were continually urging their factors, their representatives here and in other parts of the East, not to get involved in politics, not to get involved in any warlike activities, not to try and acquire territory or administer territory, or to get involved in tax collecting and so on. So that's the first 150 years of the company, completely irrelevant to what happened subsequently, and the conquest of India, if you like, by the British. Then there's that awful 20-year period which we associate with people like Robert Clive, when the company behaved absolutely appallingly, and there is no excuse, and I would never begin to try and defend the activities of the company in that period. But it was quite a short one, and then, as I say, it was taken, because of its abuse of power, it was taken over by the British government, but it was retained as a kind of scapegoat. So that the British government, when things were going well in India, could claim the credit. When they were going badly, or there was some defeat or something, they could blame the East India Company. And in a way, we were playing their game by continually resurrecting the East India Company as a monster that was responsible for the British conquest of India, because the facts simply don't support that.
I also want to ask you, sometimes people ask sort of, why is it relevant? Why is history relevant? Why is literature relevant? Why is it important for us in the modern day to know exactly what happened? Even as you see, of course, a parallel interest and an upsurge in interest in knowing, what exactly led to sort of even nation building or whatever it is. As a historian, how do you feel when?
What's the point of history?
Well, I mean, why study it? As in, for example, why do you find it important to be immersed in history?
I think, in one sense, it's a question of identity. How do you know who you are, where you stand, what you should be aspiring to, what society you really want to have, if you don't study what's been done in the past? History can be studied for lessons, but it's also, I think, actually much more kind of personal thing. I'll take my position. I live in Scotland, but I was educated in England, so I'm a kind of Anglo-Scot, if you like. And at the moment, relations between Scotland and England are slightly strained. Scotland voted to stay in the European community, and England voted to leave it. And so I have to actually examine my own conscience and think, well, am I Scottish or am I English? Where do I belong in this sort of argument? Or it could be about being in Europe, or it could be any number of different things. And history is what helps us to identify where we are, who we are, where we are. And I think that's very important.